They stood at the edge of the Thames while the tide muttered its interminable law. In the years when the sea promised escape and empire demanded order, the same water that carried loot and rumor also became a boundary the state could cross with ropes, courts, and invisible sentences. The story historians rarely led with is not only that women took up arms and sails, it is that once captured, they were subjected to a second violence, one practiced by officials, customs, and courts, that aimed less at ending a life than at erasing a person and enforcing a gendered lesson in public. If you want to hear how maritime justice treated these women and why it matters, stay with this narrative to the end. Subscribe and like if you care about historical justice and forgotten lives. Adjudication began where authority liked to show itself, in stone courthouses smelling of lime and ink, or on temporary benches crowded beside the harbor when naval captains delivered a prisoner. Admiralty law, designed to police goods and navigation, had been stretched into a net for bodies. The charge of piracy cut across customary protections. At trial, the accused were not treated as miscreants of domestic disorder, but as enemies of commerce and empire. For women, the legal field was narrower still. They entered courts already framed as anomalies, their gender used both to sensationalize and to punish. Pleading the belly, the records note, was a technical respite. It described the claim by a woman sentenced to death that she was pregnant. A midwife and jury of matrons could examine and, if they confirmed gestation, postpone execution until after childbirth. The phrase carried a grim arithmetic. It could save a life at least temporarily, but it also exposed the woman's body to official inspection and turned private fate into public procedure. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, captured in 1720 and tried in Jamaica, availed themselves of precisely that mechanism. Contemporary observers recorded the plea with the same clinical economy used elsewhere in admiralty lists. Later retellings embellished the drama. Records suggest that their pleas delayed immediate hanging, but archival silence and speculation about subsequent outcomes became part of the punishment, a legal fog that allowed authorities and later historians to close the case by indirection. Trials themselves were performances of power. Judges and naval officers read out lists of stolen goods and torn flags. Witnesses, some coerced, some eager, pointed out knife scars or the presence of women's clothing in a captain's chest. A woman in such a dock learned how thin her claim to a self-fashioned life could be when tested against the state ledger. At times, the spectacle was almost gleeful. Newspapers and broadsides delighted in the atypical nature of a woman with a cutlass, and judges met that curiosity with an extra edge of sanctimony. The legal reasoning often foregrounded the supposed impropriety of women at sea as an aggravation.
To be a pirate was bad. To be a pirate woman was to flout nature and necessity, and thus deserved exemplary correction. The correction, however, was rarely simply a rope. Execution dock on the Thames was designed to teach. From Wapping, the gallows faced the river. The flow of ships provided an audience both literal and symbolic. Commerce itself watched. Hanging was the visible ritual, but for women, the ritual was complicated by gendered performance. Public humiliation, stripping, parading, shaming worked differently on a body already subject to social constraints. Frequently, authorities sought to make moral theater of women's punishment in ways that satisfied prurient curiosity and reasserted masculine authority. Contemporary accounts spoke of crowds whose curiosity turned to cruelty. Spectators mocked, gossiped, and, in the coarse language of pamphlets, rated the women's courage or lack of it. To be delivered to the rope was public and total. Yet for many captured women, an alternative fate, if less dramatic, was worse. After the trial, naval captains and colonial agents had discretion. They could hand a prisoner over to plantation owners, lodge them on hulks, or place them in servitude. In the colonies, sexual subordination and forced concubinage became part of a shadow justice. A woman's body, already criminalized, was also commodified. Men in positions of authority, governors, merchants, captains, could reassign a seized woman to a master or a household in need of labor and entertainment. Official records rarely called this by its name. Where papers recorded a disposition or assignment, other lives were implied. Beds, ship's berths, latrines, and the small violences of routine domination. Mary Critchett's case illustrates a harsher administrative calculus. Contemporary correspondence and shipping lists suggest she was moved through several hands after capture, assigned first to a colonial magistrate and then to a merchant house needing a female servant. The sparse files offer no testimony of consent. They show instead entries of inventory, one female taken with the crew. That language flattened personhood into property notation. Where the law had once been a tool to punish transgression, it was being repurposed to replenish labor and to reassert racial and gender hierarchies. The colonized world required labor. The imperial court system quietly supplied it. Flogging and public humiliation formed yet another register of gendered punishment. Naval discipline relied on the lash for order, and when applied to women, it served a mixed purpose: to injure the body, to mark it, and to demonstrate that even a hardened woman could be reduced. Again, authorities balanced spectacle and institutional cowardice. Sometimes they performed a ritual halfway between mercy and humiliation. Figures of authority would order lashes administered in public, not solely because pain was punitive, but because the act was theatrical.
It demonstrated the state's reach into skin. Survivors' accounts suggest the degradation lingered. Scars were a permanent map of submission. The memory of eyes watching while lashes fell became a form of social death. The hulks, decommissioned ships turned floating prisons, were where the empire relegated those it did not wish to squarely face. Disease threaded the timbers, rats threaded the cots, and the river's breath was thick with salt and stench. Men and women confined in these hulks died slowly of fever, malnutrition, or neglect. For women, the hulks were not simply a place of punishment, but of erasure. Records were slender. Where men might generate a ledger entry, the lives of women aboard hulks often left only a clerical line: died aboard, or none at all. The system preferred such small silences. A death at sea could be written as a misfortune, a fever, a consequence. But the institutional choice to let a person wither away without ceremony revealed a deeper intent: to make absence ordinary. This was not accident but design. If spectacle taught citizenship and the law, invisibility taught a different lesson: that the empire could dispose of inconvenient bodies without the moral labor of public execution. A hung woman still required a rope, a scaffold, a notice in a paper. A woman slipped into servitude or into a hulk required only administrative neglect. In either case, the final report, if any, was designed to resolve anxiety. The state had acted. Order had been restored. The social machinery that produced these outcomes was complex. Admiralty judges worked with local governors, who worked with merchants and naval officers. Newspapers fed the public appetite for sensational accounts that, in turn, legitimized harsher measures. Planters and traders wanted labor. Military men wanted quiet discipline. Judges wanted precedent. When their interests converged, the result for many women was less a definitive end than a transformation. From person to spectacle, from agent to commodity, from presence to absence in the historical record. Consider Anne Bonny and Mary Read more closely because their liminality reveals institutional cruelty through omission as much as action. Both had served aboard ships where cross-gender performance blurred roles. They donned men's clothes, fought, and commanded. Capture, then, was also a moment of reclassification. The court lists recorded their names. Pamphlets turned them into caricatures, wanton women, curiosities. Yet, after sentencing, the narrative thinned. Mary Read is thought to have died in prison, possibly of fever. Archival entries suggest this but do not dramatize it. Anne Bonny's later life is a matter of conjecture. Some accounts argue she was pardoned, others that she vanished into obscurity. The point is not the absence of a clean ending, but the ease with which institutions allowed a story to stop being told. When official files cease,
Memory is left to rumor and to the imagination of pamphleteers more keen on titillation than truth. Gender intersected with class and race in ways that predetermined post-capture fate. A white woman with connections through marriage or patronage might be rerouted to an indenture or quietly repatriated. A black or mixed-race woman faced fewer sympathetic alters. Colonial administrators could, and often did, trade a female prisoner into a plantation household where her labor and body would be monetized. The law offered little recourse. Those who might intervene, charitable committees, sympathetic clergymen, were exceptions, not structures. Thus, the state stitched together law and economy into a punitive cloth where the most vulnerable were hidden in plain sight. These mechanisms left traces. Pamphlets and court records, when read against one another, reveal patterns. Delays that became disappearances. Petitions that disappeared into registry drawers. And the language of assignments that narrated property more than justice. People who looked back at that period, magistrates writing memoirs, journalists compiling sensational lists, often emphasized the rope and the gallows, because spectacle made a cleaner story. The quieter, bureaucratic violences, forced servitude, reallocation into domestic fields, slow deaths aboard hulks, required longer attention and, crucially, moral imagination. Yet there were moments of resistance and assertion. Women aboard ships sometimes fought, sometimes negotiated, sometimes invoked motherhood to delay execution. Pleading the belly was an imperfect tactic, but it was also a form of embodied legal argument. The human fetus as intervening witness, the feminine body compelling a reevaluation of immediate punishment. Other resistances were less legal than social. Letters from sympathetic sailors, clandestine payments, and the petitioning of patrons. These acts did not undo institutional power, but they complicated it, introducing frayed margins where memory could survive. As the narrative of the golden age of piracy hardened into legend, most of the women who had once walked between decks were marginalized into a few famous names and a great many silences. The archive kept what it was built to keep: lists of goods, receipts, judicial sentences. It did not keep the intimate details of coercion, the nightly humiliations, the small bargains that bought extra water or a blanket. Where it did record women, it often did so in language that flattened them, adjectives that emphasized gendered surprise, nouns that converted persons into spectacles. If Tacitus observed that they make a desert and call it peace, the imperial system did something similar. It made absence and called it order. That absence is not neutral. It was a choice to render some fates visible and others invisible, to allow the dramatic hanging to stand for justice while quieter forms of domination continued unremarked.
Remembering those choices matters, not only for historical fidelity, but for moral reckoning. We are called, as readers and citizens, to notice what institutions preferred not to look at. The slow, bureaucratic violences that leave no receipts of wrongdoing, and whose victims, because their deaths were unceremonious, are easiest to forget. There is, finally, a personal dimension to this structural account. When a woman like Mary Critchett appears in a ledger as one female taken with the crew, we should hear not an administrative shorthand, but a human life collapsed into a line. When the crowd at Execution Dock jeered, they were not only spectators of an act. They were participants in a culture that relished the spectacle of correcting transgression, especially when that transgression upset gender norms. The state's response, rope, assignment, flogging, neglect, was calibrated to teach a lesson as much as to punish a crime. The narrative that follows will trace these mechanisms in more detail, moving from courthouse to dock to hulk, pairing archival fragments with reconstructed scenes that aim neither to romanticize nor to sensationalize, but to restore texture to lives managed by empire. It will hold throughout an insistence that what officials did after capture, what they permitted, redirected, and quietly authorized, was often more destructive than the legal definition of death. The erasure they practiced was a social death, a deprivation of memory, kinship, and personhood,
and it is the work of history to call that deprivation by its name.